So why blacks? Why blacks in a restaurant? Why would blacks not be allowed to be discriminated against in a restaurant, but gay people could? Why? Why can a baker tell a gay couple, no, I'm not going to make your wedding cake because isn't it just like somebody coming into your restaurant that's black or gay and you say, no, I'm not going to serve. Welcome to Progressive Soup. We're having a little off-camera discussion about some philosophical things, and we've come to the conclusion that thankfully in Connecticut we don't have to deal with these marriage issues because we settled that a number of years ago. We're all somewhat liberal libertarian, in the sense that we're happy that that gay people can get married in Connecticut and there's no discrimination against them. But that's for another day. We have Emily Volpentesta co-hosted myself.
Thank you.
And Dan Carter. We don't have Jonathan Steinberg. Jonathan was unavoidably detained. So what Dan's doing, and Dan and Jonathan are on the same page in a lot of respects and on a lot of the issues. They have a lot of good discussions with one another. Both were very happy about being on the show together, but things happen. So Dan's taking the full spectrum of responsibility to explain all the different sides and everything in between of the issues relative to the Connecticut budget. Dan Carter, continue talking about the Connecticut budget. Make sure we're going to talk about education specifically,
yes,
because we talked at the end of last night's show about Sheff v. O'Neill, when the courts ruled that Connecticut schools were discriminatory and that schools like the Bridgeport schools were way underfunded relative to schools like Greenwich schools, New Canaan schools, Westport schools, and that had to be addressed somehow. We have educational cost sharing that addresses that somewhat, but we're going to talk a little further about that. But Dan, first of all, identify yourself. You're going to be Dan Carter 1 and Dan Carter 2. He's the entire spectrum of politics there today. Go ahead.
Well, I am Dan Carter. I serve the 2nd District, so it's Bethel, Danbury, Reading, and Newtown. And I have 2 bowls in front of me today, speaking from both sides.
Jonathan's bowl is getting used at any rate.
I don't know which half is full or empty, but it's, glad to be here. Glad to be here again. Always enjoy coming on the show.
Oh, good. I sound very
so
strange.
With respect to the budget, I mean, where we left off in the last show, I explained the basics of where we are now and where we got here. Everything is finished now. Everything's in place. We've got the budget. Some businesses are really going to be unhappy. When the governor had come in and negotiated some of the changes with respect to the corporations, one of the things he did is he just put off some of the taxes, because originally they were retroactive to the beginning of this year. Mm-hmm. So now they're going to happen in January. So, obviously a lot of businesses aren't too thrilled with that.
GE's leaving.
Nobody wants to have to pay more. That's
right.
Human nature, whether it be from an individual perspective or a business perspective.
Well, I mean, listen, if you want to talk about, let's talk about the corporations, because one of the things, I'm a novice at politics still. I came in here, it's been 5 years now. Yeah. And obviously I had a poli-sci degree when I was younger, but I was in the Air Force, I was a pilot, I was in medical sales. Right. I wasn't a politician when I started.
Kosovo, as I recall, you flew Mercy missions into
Provide
Kosovo?
Promise. Yeah, Provide Promise.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
So that's
best mission ever. I'll give a little plug, because I went into a museum, and it's funny experience. I go to the Wright-Patterson Museum in Dayton, where I'm from.
Oh, okay.
And I take my kids into the museum. And the museum is set up by time. So you go through the Wright brothers and you go through the different eras. And right before it, somewhere like near the modern era, there's this display on one side, and I go up and we look at it, and there's my patch from Provide Promise. And it was so funny, and I learned things about it that I didn't even know then, because I was flying the mission. We were working with Germans and French aircrew.
You were just actually doing the job rather than overlooking it.
Yeah, never thought of it. I knew what we were doing was important. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no question about it, because the United Nations at that time were putting people in safe zones, and we would come in at nighttime and we would deliver food by airdrop, or we would fly in and out of Sarajevo doing the day mission. And it was interesting. So I'm walking through the museum, and here's my Provide Promise patch. Yeah. And the one thing that struck me was that through that event, we did more airlift than the Berlin airlift. which,
That is
Berlin
incredible.
Airlift, if you remember history, was a big deal. East-West Berlin,
Yeah,
how they were bringing things in because
When the walls came
it was
down.
basically under siege in those days, years and
Right.
years ago. We did more airlift than the Berlin Airlift. It was just a really amazing experience. So my background was always other stuff.
Yeah.
So coming into the political world, it was just a lot different. It was a lot different for me. So looking at where we've come with respect to the budget and how you look at corporations, I've tried to kind of see where everybody stands, and there's really two sides of what goes on up there in the extremes. One side seems to look at all the corporations as people. They look at the corporation as an entity that, by God, they should be paying their fair share, and the other half is just looking at it as a business and saying, well, don't let them pay any tax, and this way they'll hire more people, hopefully. The other side says they're not going to hire people.
Speaking
it's always
of promise, that's always their promise that they'll hire more people. Sometimes they don't necessarily follow through on that. Sometimes the money goes into shareholders' pockets.
Well, and that's the other part of it. They people look at the shareholder part of it. So it's been a very interesting dilemma to try to find the balance in that. Because listen, good government always comes at balance. It really does. I mean, philosophically, you may lean one way or the other on some of these issues, but you look at some of these businesses, and if I can give them $10 million back in taxes and say you don't pay that $10 million, if they in fact go out and spend $8 million of it hiring people, well, okay, so I've lost $2 million, but I've probably got more people with jobs.
And
that's one side.
And the rollover from that tends to be because every job creates more jobs beyond it, because you've got people with money to spend. They're going to turn around and it enhances the local store owners that they're spending money and take the money and spend it. The money flows freely. It's always that's capitalism at its best.
Right. So the other part of this is then you look at a corporation who makes a lot of money, and you say, well, how much of that profit should come back to the state?
Right.
It's a difficult thing, but that's what we face, especially this year with the corporations in Connecticut, because it's gotten to a point where people feel like it's gone over the edge. So in this budget, the companies was a big thing, and the hospitals were a big thing. I don't know if you've heard that.
Yep.
Danbury Hospital got crushed in this budget.
But they're joining now with New Mover.
Well, what's happening is Danbury obviously has becoming an accountable care organization. So if you look what was put in with the Affordable Care Act, they want hospitals to group together. They want the hospital now to be the place where there's a lot of sharing of resources,
sharing of information, so people don't get treated multiple times,
multiple tests,
or more stuff is more expense on them than is reasonably necessary.
Right.
So it keeps costs down, and that's the point of the Affordable Care Act.
That is one of the. There's a lot more to it, obviously, but with respect to the hospitals, that's what we've encouraged. Now, on the other side of the state, we have a number of senators who don't want hospitals, specifically Yale, to get too big. So they were doing things that would actually increase the property taxes on institutions, which was not good for them. Or they'll withhold more Medicaid funding, which has been an issue.
Right.
And particularly this year, too, there were a lot of funds and taxes put in place that really hurt the medical industry, especially Danbury Hospital.
Right.
And they got hit harder than a lot of the hospitals around, which was tough.
So a lot of legislators who represented districts that did not have a hospital in their district, is that how it played out?
It was party line. It was party line, unfortunately, because sometimes these things are, and it was party line, and I didn't feel like the local reps. This is partisan. I didn't feel like the local reps stepped in enough for Danbury Hospital.
Okay.
But it is what it is, because they looked at balancing these budgets on the backs of the hospital in some instances.
Right.
They do it a number of ways. But Danbury in particular is going to have a tough time. And even though they're all together, Western Connecticut region, so Danbury Hospital, Milford Hospital got hit,
and
Norwalk Hospital got hit. Everybody got hit. Surgery centers got hit. There was a new 6% tax on surgery centers, which to me is crazy talk, because they operate on very small margins in a surgery center, actually, but it's gonna be rough.
I'm laughing about the remark about the surgery centers, because today is Monday, and even though it's Thursday, it's really Monday. And Friday, I had my gallbladder taken out at the Danbury Hospital Surgical Center. So
were you in the hospital, or were you in the outside?
In the outpatient surgical center. And let me tell you, anybody that's thinking about or maybe needing to have your gallbladder removed. It's the simplest operation ever. It was an hour operation. I was about an hour and a half waking up afterwards. Once I woke up, they said, well, Kristen can take you home as soon as you feel like you want to go. So an hour later, we were gone.
It's amazing, isn't it?
A sip of something and some applesauce, and I was ready to go home and felt pretty decent the next day. Mm-hmm. It was a very simple procedure.
Well, a lot of procedures are done like that in small outpatient surgery centers outside the hospital,
which is less expensive.
Less expensive, less complications due to infection.
Yep.
I mean, it's really a great thing. So now what we're doing is we're going to make it harder for some of these smaller surgery centers to stay in business too, which was. Yeah. But again, what happens is it's in Hartford, we're looking to fill that void of dollars, and there's always an argument between spending.
Does that affect does that in any way affect the immediate medical care? Are they taxed differently than they used to be?
No, I don't think there were any changes to affect them.
Okay, unless those are great, because those are great. Better that than the emergency room.
Unless it was hospital owned. See, if it was hospital owned, it could affect them. Okay. Because what they did is they said, remember I mentioned property taxes?
Yeah.
So what they do is they say, all right, if the hospital owns or takes over something to buy like an immediate care, it's not normally taxed. Okay. Or with property tax, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which means there was money coming from the state back to the municipality to help make up for that little difference. Well, now what they're saying is we're not going to do that program anymore. The hospital has to pay the property tax on it. So that is discouraging the hospital now from going out in the community to put these immediate cares because there are some significant property taxes involved. So that's where the policy doesn't.
I think that's actually a good thing because I like to have the separation of to encourage competition within the healthcare framework, to have separate ownership of immediate medical care than the hospitals owning. My God, having their tentacles in everything.
Yeah. Right. Well, but again, there's the dilemma we face with the Affordable Care Act. Remember, the Affordable Care Act is geared towards making the hospitals the tentacles and actually squelching some of the private industry.
Exactly.
I mean, the best example you'll see that now is anybody out there who's gone to a cardiologist in the last 10 years, it's changed dramatically where a lot of the cardiology practice, which should be on their own, many of them have tighter relationship or even owned by hospitals.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Because what they found was they were getting better reimbursement in the hospital because that was set up to drive business to the hospital.
Okay.
So it's a very interesting dynamic, and I don't have all the answers. It's just I'm just kind of speaking to the changes
something
that are
to
taking
watch
place.
for the audience, and take a look at it and give your thoughts and report back to us as far as what you find to be the case, what you determine. So civic involvement, not only in government, but in local access television.
No, I just think that now it's for a private practice to exist today. I mean, pretty soon everything's going to be owned by the hospital.
Yeah.
It's impossible now. Like my father, if he had to start today, wouldn't be possible. So
that's interesting. That's a good point. Emily's dad is Edward Volpentesta, a great local general practitioner, one of the 3 great local general practitioners that Bethel has, that are probably coming toward the end of their careers. Ed Volpentesta, Ted Blum, and Dave Shapiro, that are all part of. I don't know if you'd call them a dying breed, but it's probably less likely nowadays for someone to go into general practice to begin with, and certainly to be on their own or in a small group is probably less likely than it used to be.
Very difficult.
So it may be, I don't know for the better, I don't know for the worse, I'm not sure, but it's definitely a difference that's coming.
You bring up, I think, the best point, David. The best point is for better or worse.
Yeah.
Like, on one hand, we're doing the Affordable Care Act, and we're saying we want to drive people in these institutions, and we want to make that the idea to save costs and connect everybody through information technology. On the other hand, we may be losing something like the guys like Dr. Volpentesta, who I called on when I was in medical sales.
Right.
And I would rate as like a really great doctor.
They've been going out the door. They've been on the way out for decades now.
Well, look at it this way, because
probably since HMOs, which is back to the 70s.
Yeah. I would say it has been a malpractice.
Yeah.
I mean, Connecticut is a horrible place to do business with respect to malpractice. Anyway, there needs to be tort reform. The attorneys are a very powerful lobby. You've got lots of tort tort reform stories because I'm very involved in that. You know, coming from the medical side, you know, being in the medical world at one time, and I'm not there now.
Right.
I know a lot about what was going on. So when you go to the legislature, you intend to get involved in a lot more of those issues because you have knowledge. So with guys like your father, I don't know how people start up like him again, because now they have to invest in expensive technology, to be able to have electronic medical records, to get their reimbursement.
They get penalized.
It's kind of like stick or carrot nowadays, with no carrot. It's all stick.
The smaller stick or the larger stick.
Yeah, pretty much.
Take your choice.
But it's real hard for men like him, and they're great physicians, and we lose some of that real personal touch, I think, in medicine. So it'll be interesting to see as this evolves. Like a lot of these groups are getting bigger. They do compete with each other, trying to have good medicine and personalized medicine and all that. So it's going to be an evolving market, but it's definitely going to be different. There's no question
Hopefully
about it.
Hopefully it'll be consumer driven to the point where doctors at least will be able to spend that time, like my doctor Ted Blum, who's great. Shout out to you, Ted.
He is.
Always has some time. Always has some time for me. He's a terrific general practitioner, family physician, and
they're good. They're really good physicians. I mean, it's interesting too. People might look at those individuals and say, "Well, somehow they're not with today's times," but they were. Like you would go to a Grand Rounds opportunity in Danbury Hospital where they'd have education.
Yeah. Right.
Those were always the people you saw there. There were always the people who were keeping touch on what was going on, and so the service and the quality was really, really good. But then they also have that personalized touch. And we're doing things, unfortunately, in medicine that, I should say legislatively in medicine, that I even question. We're trying to have a lot more nurse practitioners. Which nurse practitioners are very good, but on one hand, we're stacking the deck with nurse practitioners specifically. We're saying nurse practitioners no longer have to practice under a physician.
Oh,
very controversial, but that happened very recently.
I think there's good and there's bad in that for APRNs.
Yeah. Well, again, from a policymaker perspective, I'm trying to figure out the best way that it helps my constituents. And we keep the cost structure reasonable. We have the quality health care we need. And it's hard from the legislative part. Because you see, and tort reform, as we mentioned, that's another big thing in Connecticut. That
I'll grant you something on that, but it won't be a lot because I've read that in many places that lawsuits add to the cost of health care is like 2%. It's not a huge amount. It might be more the fear of lawsuits which drives the concern and the complaints more than the actual cost.
But you bring up one of the huge issues about tort reform. It's the fear. I think you're right on the money with that.
But we can't let fear drive us.
No. But what does fear do? What I'm speaking of is defensive medicine.
Yeah.
The fear means more testing, more cover your butt.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of costs associated with that fear. Now, I don't know how you measure that. I do know this.
Hard to quantify.
I know there have been times where a number of years ago we considered a bill called Certificate of Merit, where what it would do is change some of the rules in. It's complicated. When a physician weighs in on a court case of somebody, they give what they call a certificate of merit to say the case has merit, if it's good or bad.
Right.
Well, that physician has to have certain qualifications. Like if it's an orthopedic surgeon being sued, this person should be an orthopedic surgeon.
Yeah.
Well, the attorneys wanted to change that. And they said, well, this should be able to be anybody who's an expert. Well, that could be somebody who doesn't ever operate.
Right.
That could be somebody who's a neurologist and looks at it much differently. Like it opened the door, and with that, we knew categorically that the insurance rates were going to go up 30%. That's what all the number of people out there said. So there's definitely a correlation there. The question is, to the insurance, it's the insurance part of it, the fear of defensive medicine, there's definitely a cost correlation there. And we try to fight that battle every year. But I think it's a big deal in Connecticut.
Medical care has just gone up, and I attribute it to the HMOs and their 30% overhead more than anything else. But there are a lot of things that have driven up the cost of medicine in America substantially more than every other country in the world, and most of the other countries in the world have socialized medicine, and people say, no, it's no good. But you know what? It's pretty good, and the evidence of that is longevity. Longevity is greater in all these other nations that have socialized medicine. Quality of life is better. Infant mortality rate better than in America. So there's something about those countries that they're doing a good job. And a shout out to today. It's the day that Cuba and the United States have diplomatic relationships again, as they probably should have had a long time ago. Now the Cubans don't have to be driving around 1950 Packards as their principal car.
I didn't know about that.
So education. So we had this court case in Connecticut decades ago, Sheff v. O'Neill, and Governor O'Neill, who was governor at the time, the state was sued because, quite rightly, there's an imbalance in education in Connecticut. Kids in Bridgeport had just a fraction. You had two separate educational systems. You had a system for the wealthier in towns like Greenwich and Westport and New Canaan. You had folks that were in the middle, like I'd say Bethel, and somewhat to that degree Danbury, where kids got a median amount of educational funding through property taxes, and you had kids in Bridgeport and Hartford that really had crap, to put it bluntly. They did not get enough money. Now, the answer that we came up with, as you well know, because you're in the legislature, so we came up with something called educational cost sharing, where according to municipalities' needs, money is given back from the state to those communities to attempt to balance it so that every kid gets somewhat equitable amount of dollars in terms of educational money to pay for their education. So presumably the textbooks are going to be similar. They can spend similar amounts of money for qualified teachers, and things will balance out somewhat. I'm going to say there's been some success in that, but I'm going to propose here and let you speak on it, because I know you think a lot about education. The notion that property tax, which funds education for the most part, property tax should not be the means to fund education. That Bethel should not be giving, I think it's about 60% of its property tax money goes toward education. And then we get a little bit of the educational cost sharing funds back from Hartford. If you had, rather than have property tax paying for education locally, if you took that part right out of the budget, reducing property tax on homeowners, on businesses, on people that rent, that pay money through their rent for the owner of the property's property taxes, and tenants do pay. Tenants do pay the money for that. I mean, the landlord raises the rent because the property tax goes up. That's just a natural thing to happen. And took that and had a higher state income tax. Now, I know that higher state income tax is probably going to fall, as it does in Connecticut, on the wealthier citizens. That's the way we have it. It's a progressive tax. It's a graduated tax. If you don't make very much money, pretty much don't pay any tax in terms of state income tax, state sales tax. Not state sales tax, but state income tax. If you had the money go directly into the state fund through a higher income tax, and had every child in Connecticut get the same amount of money to fund their local education, I want you to speak on that. Tell me what you think. It's a big,
a lot to it.
It's a big, wide subject. We hadn't talked about it in advance, so we're kind of putting Dan on the spot. Whatever input you can put into that, I would very much like to hear.
Sure. Well, first off, there's no question the concept of educational cost sharing definitely was a pretty valiant effort at evening the playing field. It has huge problems. I mean, namely, the formula has needed to be reworked for years, but it really doesn't matter because nobody's working with the formula anyway.
Right.
We haven't actually done it with the formula for a number of years. It's pretty much whatever the governor and the administration decides is what they're giving out.
Yeah.
So it's a really crappy way to do policy, if you ask me. With respect to property tax, I'm leaning your way. I mean, really am. After being here and learning what I've learned, I don't think property tax is the best way to fund education. It's really not. I kind of, it's interesting because then the question is, well, one of the problems with property tax too is it's very difficult to do the mill rates in these different places and get more property tax. I think it's harder a system to manage. And right now, the way things are, it can be very inequitable for some of the suburban districts. I'm under intense pressure in my area because we don't get a lot back.
Yeah.
We don't get a lot back. And I'm talking even in Bethel where we could, and the other part of it is special education funding is a huge problem because we haven't been getting the money back for special education. And Bethel has a wonderful program, but what happens is people move here for it.
Right.
And we don't get it fully funded.
That's one of the things that draws people to wherever they decide to live.
Yeah.
People go to Danbury sometimes because Danbury has has like 8 elementary schools, and because of that, they can have a flute teacher that goes from school to school to school.
Right.
So you can have programs in a city like Danbury that you wouldn't have in Bethel.
Right.
Yeah, it's true.
You can have a Russian teacher in Danbury.
So to your point about how do we structure the taxes? I'm not exactly comfortable with the notion right off the bat of a progressive tax for that. But could there be another way of taxing? Could there be a flat tax? Something that everybody pays that's strictly education?
Yeah.
I don't know, because my short time in the legislature, I've learned that most everything goes straight in the general fund, and Connecticut takes a cut before they give it back to anybody.
Yeah.
And everything becomes political.
Right.
If there were a way to set something up that would go directly to schools, it probably would be a much better way and a much more equitable way.
And we were talking about this before we came on. Historically, that's something that I think anybody would be in agreement on, is that when money is set aside for a specific purpose, whether it be education, whether it be driver training, anything, that's where that money should go. It should not go into a general fund and then dribs and drabs of it come
But
back out.
the watchdogs out there, the people need to be engaged and aware. Like when those funds get swept, and meaning when we say swept, meaning they go in for a budget and they remove those funds because they've accumulated a certain level. Instead of using them for their intended purpose, then somebody will go in and will take the money out. They'll use it to balance the budget.
Yeah.
So there needs to be more oversight of some way.
Right.
But when it's in the hands of the folks up there, there's such a disconnect of what people know what's going on in their legislature, and you can't. It's very difficult to keep track of that. I mean, we're all doing our day jobs and we're out in our normal life. But we need more watchdogs to watch those kinds of things. So if we were able to truly do some sort of education fund that the folks in Hartford couldn't touch.
Right.
And with that, we're going to have to call it a day. We've had some good discussions about the state budget. I think Dan's done a pretty admirable job of explaining the broad perspective of sides on the issue. Jonathan Steinberg and Dan are good friends. They know each other well. They speak together frequently, and I think that's why they would have made good folks to have on at the same time.
I have your bowl, John.
So John, your bowl of soup is here waiting for you. Maybe.
That's right.
It's been Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson. Emily Bolton Testicola. Dan Carter. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for letting me do that.